In this video, we are going to look at relative and absolute cell referencing in Excel, and sometimes it's referred to as cell anchoring. So here you see that we have our tips and tricks file, and we are on the cell reference worksheet. And we're going to use this worksheet in order to calculate the price of a stock for different growth rates and required rates of return. The first thing we're going to do is assume that the value in cell A1 is our dividend at time 1. And so the equation, if we want to use the Gordon growth model, our equation in order to calculate the price of a stock is equal to the dividend at time 1 divided by R minus G, which is the required rate of return minus the growth rate of the dividend. And so in order to keep it straight, I'm just going to make a note here that that's going to be our dividend at time 1. This will be our required rate of return. And the first thing I'm going to do is expand the number of required rate of return options that we have. So I'm going to select or activate cells B6 through D6. And then I'm going to use the cursor. And I'm going to make sure that we hover over this green box in the bottom right corner. And we're going to have a fill handle that pulls up. And I'm going to use this fill handle. And I'm going to drag this to the right. And maybe go out to 11%. So that would be one way to get the values in there. But you notice it's not very flexible. If we were to change this one, it would not update the remaining values. And so maybe there's a different way to do that, and I'll work on that with column A. So I'm going to undo that action by holding down Control and hitting the letter Z. And I'm going to update the value in cell A8. And I'm going to make that equal to cell A7, and I'm going to add 0.5%. And now when I do that, I can activate cell A8, and I can use our fill down shortcut in order to fill in the different values. So there I was holding down Shift and the down arrow. And now I'm going to hold down Control and hit the letter D for down. And you'll see that it fills that formula down. If I hold down Control and hit Home, that'll take us back to cell A1. And so here we have a possible table where we could determine the values of a stock price in these particular cells. And so again, we need to think about how to calculate the price of a stock. And using the Gordon growth model, it's going to be our dividend at time 1 divided by R minus G. And so in this cell, we can put an equal sign. Anytime we want to start a formula, we start with an equal sign. And it's going to be our dividend at time 1 divided by the quantity of our required rate of return minus our growth rate. And we're going to use this as our growth rate in column A. And then a closed parenthesis. And then I'm going to hit Enter. And what we find is that a stock with a dividend of $2.10 at time 1 with a required rate of return of 8% and a growth rate of that dividend of 1%, it has a value of $30. And now we're going to look at how to use one of the most powerful features in Excel, and that's cell referencing. So before we said that we could fill across simply by using this fill handle, right? This fill handle that's here, we could fill this entire row here. And so if I wanted to select this entire row and fill across, you'll see that there's an error message. And the reason there's an error message, so here we see the values for cell B7. As we fill across, what happens is Excel will use a relative reference in order to calculate that value. So we're taking some text of dividend at time 1 and dividing it by some quantity. Here we have 0 divided by some quantity or some value, and it's going to create an error across this table. And so what we need it to do is let Excel know that we want it to use certain values. And so I'm going to undo these values by holding down Control and Z. And I'm going to go back in to edit this cell by pressing F2. And what we want to do is note that for every value in this table, we want it to reference cell A1 in the numerator. Right, our dividend at time 1, we always want it to reference cell A1. In order to do that, we have dollar signs that we'll use in front of both the column and the row number. So I'm going to put a dollar sign in front of each of these. And that's going to say, because there's a dollar sign in front of this column letter, it's going to say always refer to that column. And in this case, because there's a dollar sign in front of the number 1, it's always going to refer to that cell. So this first portion says always take the value that's in cell A1. And now that we have everything referencing cell A1, what I'm going to do is fill this value right. So I'm going to hit enter, hold down the shift key, hit my right arrow, hold down control, hit R for right. And we see that we still have some issues here. And what's happening, if I go to cell C7, you'll notice that it's referencing cell A1 for the dividend. It has the correct cell for the required rate of return, but for the growth rate of the dividend, it's using the wrong cell. And so what we need to do here is make sure that we're referencing the correct cell. And what we want to happen, as we move across this row, we want it to maintain a reference to column A. And so I'm going to go back into this cell and hit F2. And I'm going to put a dollar sign in front of this letter A because I want the column to stay the same. So I'm going to hit enter, hold down Control, Shift, and the right arrow, then hold down Control and hit the letter R, and we see that it filled in correctly. So as I look at these different cells, you'll notice that we're referencing the right inputs for this formula. And so now we may think, well, I can go ahead and fill this down. So I'm going to hold down Control, hold down Shift, hit the right arrow, and then hold down Shift and the down arrow, hold down Control D to fill down. And we notice that it appears there's some extra errors as well. Another way to do that, if you don't want to use the shortcuts, you could simply highlight those cells and then use the fill handle in order to fill. But again, that's going to fill the wrong values. And so I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. I'm going to go back into cell B7. I'm going to activate that cell. And now we need to think about, as we move down, what we want to do is reference the cells in row 6. So if I were to look at this value, if I go down cells, you'll notice that it's referencing the cell B8, and what we really wanted to reference in this particular cell is B6. And so I'm going to delete these values, and we'll go back in and edit cell B7. And in this case, as I move down the table, I want to maintain a reference for the 6th row, and so I'm going to put a dollar sign in front of the number 6. And then hit enter, and I'm going to update the cells to the right. You notice the values will not change. Hold down Shift and the arrow, and we have a table that fills in correctly. If we look at these values, we'll see that as we move rows, it's going to adjust accordingly. One last thing, if you wanted to adjust or change the cell referencing, if you want to change the anchoring, as some people might call it, you can go into this cell and you can cycle through the different options or toggle through the different options by hitting F4. And if you're on a Mac, you could hold down the Command key and hit the letter T.